want to move on to introduce our next incredible speaker, who is Robin Hanson, who also someone I've known for quite some time. We knew each other when I lived in Washington, D.C. in a previous part of my life. And you know, Robin is an economist, but we got to know each other initially through our common interest in the technological singularity. Robin had done some work projecting, you know, what would happen to the world economy as we advance toward a Kurzweilian singularity. And he wrote a whole book recently investigating the economics of a possible future in which there's huge number of human mind uploads living in computer simulations. So a whole other type of simulation modeling, though not totally unrelated. And one of the things I and many others have always enjoyed about Robin's work is, I mean, he's willing to entertain any hypothesis and try to analyze it using the you know, conceptual, mathematical, intellectual, analytical tools at his disposal. So I mean, he's very much a rationalist. It's with this in mind that he introduced the idea of idea futures and prediction markets, which he's played a large role in spreading throughout the world. And you know, some of Robin's ideas are out there and controversial, and allowed at first a huge amount of sense after they told them keep on freaking people out. But I'm a big fan of, you know, open brainstorming and exploration of a variety of ideas, and then, you know, empirical analysis of those ideas. And I think one of the cool things with AJ simulation modeling is you can explore a wide variety of possible policies and situations within the, you know, the safe confines of your simulation world. So Robin has been thinking about some slightly out of the mainstream ideas about how we might combat COVID-19 and what alternative policies we might put into place quite different than what's currently being done in the US. He's going to talk about variolation, so sort of you know, voluntarily, intentionally allowing COVID to spread through subsets of the population, and then you know, the value that could be had by vouching that you have had COVID-19 and maybe to some extent immune already. But I will let Robin dig into these interesting topics, and I'll encourage everyone to come at this with an open mind. I mean, some out there ideas are wrong and some are correct, and you really can't tell until you open your mind and think hard about the matter at hand. So Robin, take it away.
Hello, one and all. I'm unmuted. Hopefully the connection will stay strong here. Good afternoon and nice to meet you. As our previous speaker, fascinating, said, you know, the usual right thing to do with the pandemic is to catch it early and lock it down strong. And the usual result of that has been success, to lock it down and squash it and prevent it from spreading to most everyone. In some places here in the world, we seem to have failed, at least initially, at doing it the right way. We did not catch it very early, and we have not locked down very strong. And even though there have been these models of other nations who have seemed to have done it and successfully, we refuse to just take their whole package of policies that worked and copy them wholesale. We insist on remixing our own invented new solutions based on our political constraints and tastes and everything else. And especially here in the United States, we are so far failing. And so we should continue to try to succeed, although we should be wary about, you know, trying too long if we're going to fail. But we should also just be working on a plan B. A plan B would be a plan for the scenario where we fail to contain this, and therefore we expect a herd immunity, i.e. most people to get it, and the way it stops is by most people being contagious, and then immune. That's not first best solution at all, but it may be what we have to consider. So the question is, how best to handle a plan B? Now, often people have talked about the flattening of the curve, and there is a benefit from preventing the medical system from being overwhelmed all at once. To even if most of us get it or exposed, it gets spread out over time, and so the medical system can deal with the cases as they come rather than being overwhelmed. That would be good. But I want to talk about
It looks like we lost Robin. Perhaps his connection might have dropped. Ben, you're on mute. Yeah. Okay, you're back. Yeah,
sorry.
You're back. Thank you.
My connection died. How terrible.
Yeah, we lost Dr. Hanson for a moment.
So where did I stop?
Internet seems back up again. So let's.
All right, let me continue. So as I was saying, the concept is there's a hero hotel. There's a place you go where you pay perhaps to go there, unless your health plan pays, or maybe we subsidize it. You go in, we try to infect you as soon as you get in, and then you have to stay there until you seem to be recovered and immune. We use the same criteria there as we would use anyone else recovered from anywhere else. And the advantage is usually we're doing lockdown and isolation because there's a small fraction of us who are infectious, but we don't know who they are. And so we have to do this mass policy of preventing lots of people from doing lots of social contact, because you don't know who are the people who are the actual ones we want to prevent. Under deliberate infection, you can choose exactly who's infected. And so you can use those isolation resources very efficiently. And of course, you can also choose it well before the medical system is overwhelmed. And you can choose the people who you might especially need in critical work. And you can choose the people who have the least risk of getting harmed, i.e. the young and the low comorbidities. So those are already a number of substantial benefits of deliberate infection, which might give a factor of a third or 50% reduction in death rates due to controlling that. But it turns out there's actually a much bigger reason to consider deliberate infection. Long ago in the United States during the Revolutionary War, George Washington faced the prospect of his troops getting infected with smallpox, which at the time tended to kill, 10 to 30% of the troops. In what became Canada, the US troops there did get devastated by smallpox, and that's why Canada isn't part of the US. And Washington wondered what to do, and he chose to get his troops what they call variolated, against the law of Continental Congress at the time, which forbade it. He secretly had the whole set of troops deliberately infected with smallpox according to the method that the United States had learned from African slaves who had gotten the treatment in Africa. And basically, then they all had a 1 to 2% death rate of the troops, and then they went on to win the Revolutionary War. So the concept of variolation is that not only with deliberate infection, you can control the dose and the vector of delivery and perhaps the strain. And through controls, you can dramatically lower the death rate. So with smallpox, again, it went from 20 to 30% down to 1 to 2%. We've seen with measles, people who get accidentally exposed to a high dose have gotten, say, 14 times the death rate of people who accidentally get exposed to a low dose. With SARS, we've seen a factor of 3 in differences of accidental dose rates. And in addition to being able to control how big the dose is, so initially when you get a low dose, when your immune system notices it, other systems notice it, they can have a head start in trying to build up against the smaller initial army rather than having to deal with a larger initial army. But it also seems like infecting through the skin or perhaps through the intestines might well do better than, especially for this disease, which seems to hurt the lungs a lot. And there also might be strain gains. So the idea is we might see a factor of 3 to 30 gains, and I'd say there's at least a 2% chance this would work. And what we need is an initial trial of maybe 100 people. And the problem has been there's money for it. There are people willing to volunteer, but we haven't been able to get medical ethics permission because, again, you'd be infecting with the live virus. And so there'd be a much higher risk of harm than there usually is, of course, with a successful vaccine. But if we're facing the prospect of most of us getting infected anyway, then we should have this sort of a fix ready at hand. And we should be doing the trials to be ready to go ahead with it should we need a plan B. Should it look like we are no longer able to contain it and most people will get infected. So that's the concept of deliberate infection and variolation. And as I've said, it's not for plan A. I mean, if you can find a way to prevent most people from getting it, great. But we've been doing a bad job of that, especially here in the United States. And it looks bad in the sense that even with lockdown, we've only been able to bring the growth rate down to near zero, but not to negative. And that's like hovering in the old game of a lunar lander. You just burn up your fuel, but you never manage to land. And I've estimated roughly that, say, 4 months of strong lockdown is about the same total economic harm as letting half the population get infected with this at the estimated infection and fatality rate of 0.5%. So we can't afford really long lockdowns. Otherwise, we might as well let people get infected. So the best thing we can do with this pandemic, I'd say, is to learn what to do for the next, perhaps even bigger pandemic. So this is bad, no doubt, but this isn't as bad as it could be. It could be much worse than this. So there's disputes about how fast we can do anything, but of course, if people are thinking of locking down for many, many months, a 1-month trial would be plenty fast enough to learn how to do variolation and to be ready for it in this case. But I'm more of a theorist and an economist, and I've been trying to give thought to how in general to solve these sorts of problems, how best to deal with the problem that pandemics can show up and you might do a bad job of it. And I'd say the key problem, as economists see it with the pandemic, is the externality of infection. By infecting someone else, you affect them, you make them worse off, and you don't have a sufficient incentive to pay attention to that. So when everybody knows there's a pandemic on, people have a sufficient incentive to isolate themselves to prevent themselves from being infected by other people, but they don't have a sufficient incentive to additionally try to prevent other people from being infected by them. And so the question is, how can we make sure people have that incentive? So in general, we often have a choice in dealing with externalities. One of them is regulation and another is liability. So if you think of pollution, pollution is the sort of problem that liability doesn't work very well. There's, thousands of people, hundreds of thousands of people drive cars in a metropolitan area. They all send pollution off to other people. You don't really know who sent the pollution. So what we do with pollution is we regulate. That is, we tell you your car has to have these criteria. Maybe we tax your driving. And that's a way of dealing with the externality. But if you think about, say, the externality of assault, punching someone, regulation doesn't work so well. We wouldn't want to require everybody to wear punching, boxing gloves and helmet or things like that. What we do instead for assault is we have liability. That is, we say, well, if you hit somebody, they can sue you, or you might have criminal liability, and we will punish you. And so the threat of being singled out and punished for that externality is the thing that discourages you with assault. So the question is, could we use liability instead of regulation for pandemic infections? The potential gain would be that regulation is a very one-size-fits-all, very crude approach. But what we really want, say, think about assault, we want a very context-dependent approach. We don't want just everybody wearing boxing gloves everywhere they go. We want each person to think carefully about where they swing their hands, in what context, who might care, and that sort of thing. And that's what liability gives. It gives the incentive to pay very close attention to context when making these sorts of decisions. And in the pandemic, there's a lot of context that people should be considering. Should you go to work? Who would you might be around? Are you wearing a mask? Have you had symptoms lately? If you go to the park, how far away is it from other people? Is the wind blowing? And our crude regulations are just washing all over they're not making these distinctions. Regulations of, say, 6 feet apart doesn't depend on where you are, or whether there's a closed air system, or which way the wind's blowing, or how long you stand near each other. Whether you go to work or can go to work doesn't depend on how close you are to other people at work, and all those sorts of things. So what we're lacking is sort of fine-grained incentives for people to pay close attention to the chance that they might infect someone in choosing their behavior. So liability would be the solution where we say, well, you can choose your actions. You can go to work if you want. You can go to the store if you want. But if you infect someone, you will be liable. Now, that's a standard solution for lots of other ways people hurt each other. And the question is, can it work for pandemics? So there's 2 key problems. One is you might hurt somebody a lot by infecting them. You might kill them. And so they might want to sue you for a lot. And are you worth it? So often we have a problem in our modern liability regime is that ordinary people don't have much money, so you don't sue them. And so whenever something goes wrong, people are trying to sue the company nearby or the rich person nearby because they're the only one with money. But we solve that with automobiles by requiring everybody to get automobile liability insurance. You can't be on the road unless you've purchased insurance, which guarantees that you'll have money to pay if there's an accident and somebody sues you. So the idea here is let's do that for pandemics. Infection liability insurance would then be a required thing. That is, if you want to stay locked down, stay locked down. But if you want to leave, you want a passport to go out, what you need is infection liability insurance, some company that says, we will guarantee that this person, if they infect someone, we will pay. And then, of course, the insurance company may well want to make sure you wear a mask, make sure you tell them where you go, install an app on your phone, et cetera, because they're on the hook, they're liable, which would be fine. And the other big problem with using liability for pandemic infection is figuring out who infected who. Now, at the beginning of most pandemics, test and trace is the standard solution to keeping it contained. That is, when any one person gets infected, you trace back and see who they had contact with. You figure out who might have been infectious when, and you work out the connections to figure out who infected who. So figuring out who infected who is feasible, at least with some work early in a pandemic. And the only question then is how late into the pandemic could it be feasible? So it seems to me that it is feasible if, say, part of the deal where you can get this passport to go out is not only do you have to get the insurance, but you have to install the app that says that traces where you've been when, and perhaps even you save a spit sample once a week or take a temperature readings every 2 days. Enough information so that when somebody who gets infected takes their data and matches up with this available data that they could subpoena because they got infected, that there's a high enough chance that they could get the match. Now, we don't need 100% chance we can make the match. Liability insurance often allows a penalty to added for the lower chance of catching someone. It might be only 20% of the people you catch, and that's okay. And if there's 5 people who might have infected you and you can't be sure who, then divide up the liability among the 5. That would also work. Okay. So in summary, the story here is maybe not with this pandemic, although I think if you required it, if you just said you may go out and leave home under the lockdown if you have liability insurance, insurance companies would offer it and people would buy it within a month. I'm pretty sure they'd want the revenue and people would want to leave. And of course, if you were recovered from the disease, I'm sure the insurance companies would probably give you a much lower rate. That would be the passport for being immune. And that seems like a more general, robust solution to these sorts of pandemics, which allows a lot of local behavior to adapt and doesn't require that you wait for the government to figure out the right thing to do or not to do the wrong thing and perhaps misregulate and screw it all up like the US government has. That's the idea of using vouching. So the key idea is that these people who are ready to pay for you, they vouch for you and they are your voucher. And this solution of vouching is actually something we could use for a lot of other problems in society, including criminal liability and criminal law, but I won't go there today. So I presented this concept of vouching for pandemic passports, and I also presented this concept of variolation, i.e. we might cut the death rate by a factor of 3 to 30, which is a big deal. For a plan B scenario where we expect most people to get infected, we only invoke plan B when plan A seems to fail, but we need to have a plan B ready to go. And the main way to have it ready to go is to do a small trial, which so far is feasible, but has not been approved by medical ethics because, well, there's a lot of complicated things, but basically they don't want to let people take big chances because they say you can't be informed if we don't know what the risks are. Of course, we know that the risk would be less than the existing natural infection, the accidental infection, but hey, that apparently is not good enough. Anyway, I'll stop there and take questions.
Beautiful, Robin. Very extremely fascinating and interesting talk, and I'm sure that it will spark a lot of debate and questions. So, the first one I'm going to take comes from Makita once again, which I would like to thank for his or her activity and enthusiasm. So, question is, I heard reports that COVID-19 recovery does not confer immunity. Does this nullify this option?
So when you recover, that is your body pushing it out. So at the moment of recovery, in a sense, you have been temporarily immune. That is, your immune system successfully pushed it out. The question is how long that lasts. How long do you have immunity for? So it's possible that immunity won't be for a long time. For most viruses, immunity does actually last for many, many years, but there are some for which it's short. So perhaps, say, for this disease, immunity might be an average of a year, and that would be really quite short. That makes this disease worse than it otherwise would be. With immunity, we're just making this one-time choice, whether to try to isolate to avoid it, or whether to get infected and how to get infected. If immunity doesn't last very long, we're all going to be basically making an annual choice of the same magnitude. So that means our choices just matter a lot more because there's this bigger thing. So the worse is accidental infection, the more you should be attracted by a less severe deliberate infection. The bigger the stakes. Again, if we each face a large chance every year of getting this thing and getting hit by it, all the more reason to develop a way by which we could every year not get hit as bad by a severe thing. Now, of course, if it's going to keep lasting many years, then eventually we'll get a vaccine, perhaps, and block that. But it does look like it will be many years. There are hopes for perhaps 18 months, but that's pretty aspirational. So many people have said, like, you can't really do this variolation unless you're sure it's not very bad. But I instead say, no, the worse is accidental infection, then the better it is to cut the risk from accidental infection by a deliberate infection. So if deliberate infection is a factor of 2 or 5 or 10 less bad than an accidental infection, that makes it all the more valuable to consider the worse is the disease, the higher the damages from the disease, the more often you might get reinfected because immunity is limited. All those things mean you should be more interested in finding a way to cut these disease severity.
Okay, thank you. We have another question from June. She's asking, how about corporate liability? Liability for distorting economics of the market during this pandemic? Example, people who buy up all the masks and charging a lot for masks.
So to an economist, when there is a short supply, market prices is a good way to allocate such things. That is, market prices do make sure a limited supply gets allocated to the people who are the most eager for them. So there isn't any particular reason to want to punish people who use supply and demand as a way to allocate resources, even in a crisis, even when they're important resources. The issue is corporate liability for infection, at the moment there's a discussion about workers, should they let people back to work if they're going to be held liable if somebody gets infected at work? And a basic problem with our liability system over the last decades is that because we've allowed individuals to become unable to pay and not forced to pay the way more ancient societies insisted, basically people have focused their liability efforts on corporations and large organizations like universities and governments and rich people, because that's the only place to get money. And so our whole society has focused our attention on, whenever something goes wrong, how can we find a rich person to blame so that they can do something about it? And then, of course, as a result, we've been giving corporations and rich people more power over actions in order to make them be able to solve problems. But my proposal was to hold ordinary people responsible for actions. And so if a person affects another person, the most straightforward thing to do is to sue that other person. You might want to sue their employer, perhaps, but there should be some substantial evidence that the employer is actually responsible for this infection. If the employer sort of pushed someone to do something to get infected, well, then they might be responsible. But I think we should try to get out of this habit of just always suing the rich companies whenever anything goes wrong, just because they're nearby and they've got the money. It's much better from economic incentive point of view to give the incentives on the person who can most take the action that prevents the problem. And in typical sort of pandemic situations, it is individuals who are taking most of the actions that produce the infections.
Thank you. One more question. I think we have time for a couple of more questions before the next talk. So feel free to take your time to answer. So Kiravi is asking, in my country, and she doesn't disclose what country is it. In my country, they're thinking of reopening schools because they claim children are less likely to get the virus. Is this irresponsible on behalf of the government?
Well, it all depends on how isolated the children are from everybody else. Yes, of course. As we all know, for this disease, young and healthy people face a much lower risk of getting sick or dying. So if we could isolate the young and healthy from the rest of the population, then it would be a big progress to infect the young and healthy, get them over it, and then they would no longer be a vector of infection for the other people. The problem, of course, is if you let the young people get infected while they go home and infect their parents, that doesn't work so well. So again, to remind you, my proposal for deliberate infection is that you put people in a place, you infect them, but you isolate them until they're recovered. So if you wanted to put kids in a school where they don't get to see their parents for a month or two, then they all get infected. And then after they recover, they get to go back and see their parents. I see much more the point of that. That makes much more sense. Infecting the kids at school and sending them home every night to infect their parents doesn't make so much sense.
So it is irresponsible.
Under the situation where they'd be infecting their parents, who would, and grandparents, presumably, who are the most vulnerable.
Okay, so now a very broad question. What do you think of Trump's current policies on the coronavirus?
We are failing dramatically in the United States. Trump certainly deserves some blame for that. But I'm afraid if you're hoping that if you just got rid of Trump, everything would work great, you're deluding yourself. We are failing in a great many ways that have not that much to do with Trump. Major agencies are failing, major parts of society are failing. We're just failing across the board. Maybe if we had a better leader, they would better overcome our other failures, but it would be going uphill against other failures. We have a lot of other institutions in society that are just being more visibly failing now, and we should be taking a lesson from that and wondering how we can fix it. We shouldn't rush into any fixes. I think we shouldn't say after some 2-week discussion, hey, we should do some huge big new thing because, hey, we're all scared. That's pretty dangerous too. But I hope out of this crisis, we can learn that our institutions are actually failing us. They aren't. We've been comfortable and presuming that they would do okay in a scenario like this, and they're not. And we should be focused on those institutions. Yes, I'm happy if you don't like Trump and you want to blame him, you want to dump him, fine. But if you think that fixes the problem, you're missing a lot bigger problems.
Someone is asking, is variolation an option for at-risk individuals, such as elderly, asthmatics?
So again, it depends on the chance that you will be accidentally infected. So if we had a strong enough program of variolation where we got a lot of young and healthy people variolated such that we induced herd immunity from that, so many people that the disease got crushed through that channel, then we might hope to keep the old and infirm isolated enough until they never got infected at all. That would be a reasonable hope if we could do enough deliberate infection of the young and healthy. But if we fail to deliberately infect enough young and healthy and old people feel that they are actually at risk of getting accidentally infected, then because the risk is higher, again, they should be all the more eager for some way to lower that risk. And in that scenario, I would be happy if they had the option available to them to go to the Hero Hotel. They would be facing a larger risk, but plausibly they would be gaining a larger benefit because the alternative they feared was accidental infection. Again, this is a plan B for a bad scenario, but you can't just stick your head in the sand and pretend bad scenarios might not happen. You need to be prepared. So the whole thing is here. How do we prepare and have resources and a plan available if plan A doesn't work?
Thank you, Robin. I'd like to pass the word to Ben if Ben wants to ask some questions or has some comments.
I don't have any in-depth question. I think You know, it's an interesting possibility, and I can see the sense of what you're saying in that. I mean, with the path that we're going on, it's not clear in the US we're actually going to stop the virus from spreading extremely broadly. I mean, we might, but it's certainly not clear. It's certainly much less clear here than in, say, Taiwan or South Korea or some other places. So then if it's going to spread everywhere anyway, I mean, that's a significant possibility. Then we look at how do we deal with that, and it's not like it's going to kill 70% of the population or something, right? So I mean, it's very bad, and you know, my parents are in their mid-70s. We're being very, very careful, and then we don't want them to die, right? But on the other hand, it's a death rate that's very bad, but not like at the Ebola level, right? And that is a different thing to think about. I guess the biggest question I would have is like, what proof points, what pieces of data or information or findings do you think could be uncovered that would make the case, hypothetically, for the approach you're advocating, like make the case so strongly that people would actually be moved to adopt it, right? I mean, what would be needed?
There's two groups of people to convince here. If you're just talking about convincing ordinary people to volunteer, a lot of people have already told me they would volunteer. There are already many people who are suffering, unemployed, running out of money, really want to get back to work. Many of those people would, especially being young and healthy, would be willing to take the risk of deliberate infection, even if you didn't necessarily substantially lower the death rate. But lowering the death rate would make them all the more eager. But that's only one audience, unfortunately, that we need to convince. At the moment, the obstacle isn't those people, it's the medical ethics authorities. Medical ethics authorities have sort of developed these rules over decades, these principles about how they make judgments, and they're really sort of not willing to make changes in the current context. As you know, many people have been arguing for just what they call human challenge trials, where so a usual vaccine trial, you give the vaccine to a population and then you naturally see some of them accidentally get infected, and then you see what happens to those people. But of course, now you have to have a much larger population and wait longer. What they've said is, no, let's deliberately infect some people with the virus right after we gave them this vaccine candidate and see what happens. Those have so far been denied and disapproved, but many prominent op-eds have said, no, we should allow this. And many prominent ethicists say, are you crazy? Look at the huge payoffs here. And of course, we allow soldiers and police and firemen and all sorts of people to take large risks for society. But the medical ethics people are saying, no, you can't let volunteers take these medical risks. And it's those same sort of principles that are also blocking the variolation trials, which some people have proposed and have been rejected. And so in the analysis of medical ethics, this larger social benefit just is not allowed really to be a part of the calculation. They have to say, does this person benefit personally, not even financially, personally, medically from this treatment? And can we tell them with sufficient certainty what the risks are? So their interpretation of informed consent is, you can't give someone informed consent unless you know all the parameters. So, by that standard, no one really can have informed consent to get married, because who knows how a marriage will work out. Unless you can tell people that your marriage will work out or not, apparently you can't have informed consent to get married or to take on a job or to immigrate to another country. And so, that's the problem at the moment. And unfortunately, our entrenched establishment of medical ethics is likely to simply stay entrenched and stay all the way through this. I've been
very frustrated with the bioethicists in the transhumanist context, where we've also intersected, where you have people saying, well, you don't have the right, even if you're a scientist who knows exactly what you're talking about, you don't have the right to do this or that experiment on your own body in these cases, and people cannot, who are intelligent, rational people, cannot come up and say, well, yeah, try this radical implant in my head or something, even if they know the risk and they know the benefit, and it's supposedly a free country.
Right. And yet we let people climb Mount Everest, where 1% of them die. We let people go skydiving. We let people take all sorts of other risks.
Yeah. So I would say in this context, if I understand correctly, the situation is there are medical trials that could be done, and people would volunteer for them, but we're not able.
And there's money to pay
actually
for them, but they're not approved.
and people would pay for them, but we're not willing to run these, we're not able to run these trials because of basically regulatory closed-mindedness.
Right, and it's a regulatory world. It's kind of like a court system, but imagine in our ordinary court system, if every time a court ruled on something, it was a private ruling, there wasn't a public record of it, there's no precedent set. The person who got the ruling was pressured not to tell anyone, otherwise there'd be retaliations. It's just basically this big private court system where rulings are made, and you can't really criticize it or even track it because nobody can really see all these rulings. And so that's the kind of legal system that happens for these medical.
I get it, rulings. That's certainly frustrating. And I mean, I'm speaking just personally rather than any official position. Like I don't know whether your suggestion is actually something that should be undertaken or not. It's not the aspect of all this that I've studied the most, but I mean, I clearly.
So I'll make the claim. You don't have to make the claim. I'll say, when we've looked at viruses, over 3/4 of them have big dose effects on symptoms.
Yeah.
Whereby lower doses produce, not all of them, but 3/4. And so that gives us a 3/4 chance that this one does too. Yeah. That's plenty high enough to be worth doing a small trial. But people say that's not enough information.
We should be doing trials on this and probably on a lot of other things. And I mean, if there's...
We should try a lot of things, but I resist the idea that, okay, there's 100 things, nobody knows which will work. We should just do them all. Stop saying this is better than the rest. I am saying, look, the chance of this working is much better than the average vaccine trial out there. As you know, there's 120 vaccine trials going on out there, or treatment trials. But each one of those is pretty unlikely because they're just trying all sorts of random stuff. This one is pretty sure to work. That's the claim, is that we've got so much other data on dose effects. And even if a dose effect doesn't work, we also have the delivery vector effect, which is also quite plausibly large in many cases.
The case for doing the trial feels compelling to me personally from my current understanding. And it's, it's clearly you've dug quite deep into this, and it must be frustrating to get the sort of reception that you have.
Only if I expected to have influence in the world. so unfortunately, like once upon a time, I was in the engineering community. I was a computer scientist, and computer scientists have this sense that you can do things, right? If there's a problem, if the current solution doesn't work, you try new things, and eventually you find something that works, right? You're in the computer science community, you're well aware of that. And then when I moved into social science and economics, I entered this other community where we're of the formula, we know things that work, and we know great things, but nobody will listen and nobody will do anything. And in some sense, that's what it's like to be a social scientist.
Yeah, my father, as you know, is a sociology professor, and so I've had some linkings with that world for much of my life. And yeah, it's a bit different because people are used to a world where data is very scant, and opinion and ideology often mean more than analytical results.
Actually, we often have quite a lot of data, but the key thing is that people have strong opinions about what they want to believe. So that makes doing it a lot harder. In computer science and physics and other areas like that, most people don't actually care what they believe about such things. It makes it much easier to organize a research community around it. I mean, a few people have things they care about because they've invested in a research line or something, but most people really don't care.
Well, that'll be a whole other interesting discussion to have on the.
Right. And I think our time is up here, so I should.
Philosophy and sociology of physical science, but I think we'll have to thank you for a very stimulating and interesting talk. Yeah, thanks a lot for joining us. And I think since we're running a bit behind, we can just skip the break we were going to take here and move on to the next speaker, who is ready and waiting. So yeah, thanks a lot. Thanks a lot, Robin.